Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad. I am an associate professor at Schar School, and with me today is Professor Eric McGlinchey, also an associate professor at Schar School. And this is the 11th episode of Schar Conversations, and we are addressing the situation in Kazakhstan in context, which today means in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Good afternoon, Eric. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Bassam, for having me. Good afternoon.
I am very happy that you are with us. And even though we planned this a little before, we just got around to doing it. And now, actually, we have more to talk about. And of course, it's not more good news, it's more bad news for so many people. And I know you're personally also connected to the situation. So I would like us to have this conversation in context, although, in fairness, we should address the Kazakhstan situation for the better part of the conversation. So I'll let you start with any thoughts you would like to share about what's happening right now, and then we'll circle back to Kazakhstan.
Yeah, sure. Again, well, thank you. It's hard not to talk about Kazakhstan without also talking about Ukraine. So I think the two are linked. Let me just start with an analogy. The way I see what's going on right now, Putin is acting like a jaded lover, a lover who's been rejected, um, and he is holding Ukraine hostage. He's holding the entire world hostage. But what Putin doesn't realize is no one in Ukraine actually ever loved him, and he's made a mistake, and he's lashing out. He's being incredibly violent, and I ultimately don't think he's going to get what he wants. So that's kind of how I see the situation. I think he made a mistake anticipating that there were going to be people in Ukraine that would welcome his intervention, and that's where I think there's a fundamental difference between what's going on in Ukraine and what we saw in early January in Kazakhstan.
Thanks, Eric. And definitely, we are in a situation that requires a lot more discussion. So we will definitely come back to this. And you and I, just before we started taping, talked about a potential conversation that we can have with our colleagues on this podcast later on, with you co-hosting, if you would be willing. In the meantime, can you please let us know what happened in Kazakhstan in January? And I say this, and of course, leading up to then, and I say this because it seems that everyone, has heard about what happened, or sort of echoes of what happened, but so many of us do not know much about that entire region of Central Asia, which is so crucial in so many ways, not just to world politics, but also to the local setting. And I must say that somebody who comes also from Middle East studies, where the region is really almost contiguous. In fact, it is contiguous. There's very little that people know, even in the Middle East, about Central Asia. So we're not just alone in not knowing very much about it. So if you can shed some light with some context, that's not good. That's embarrassing. I wonder whether we should cut this in the final copy or not. So, if you don't mind, Eric, shedding some context on what has transpired over the past couple of months in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan in particular, that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, I'm tempted to go into the deep history of Kazakhstan because I think it's important to realize that what happened in January is not a one off. But let me begin with the proximate drivers. And they're probably proximate drivers that people living in authoritarian environments the world over will understand. Uh, the immediate cause that precipitated the protests in Kazakhstan was this move to raise fuel prices. This is a country which, I guess, relative to Central Asian standards, people are doing fairly well compared to, say, Tajikistan. But relative to world standards, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of income inequality. And when people heard that fuel prices were going to go up, and then when they saw fuel prices go up, they took to the streets. So this was initially an economic motivated protest. And I think it's important to emphasize that because if people followed the media coming out of Central Asia, coming out of Russia, and to a certain extent, coming out of the West, The way that this was framed by the Kazakh president Tokayev was that his country was suddenly being attacked by foreign extremists. And that's, that could be further from the truth. There were no foreign extremists, but Tokayev made this claim because Kazakhstan is a member of a post-Soviet treaty organization called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And as a member of that treaty organization, Kazakhstan can call on other members, including Russia, for assistance in the event that the country is facing external attacks. So the framing of this as a foreign attack was critical for Tokayev to get the assistance of Moscow. So those are the proximate drivers. Now, there's a lot of deeper drivers behind what we're seeing here. And Bassam, you as a scholar of authoritarianism, I think you'd find many of these deeper drivers familiar to, say, Syria or anywhere else in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And I also would like to share that we are teaching, you and I are teaching, or have been teaching in the past, because I haven't done it for a couple of years, courses on authoritarianism in which we discuss these different regions. And happy to continue the conversation, especially as we are seeing a drift worldwide towards more centralization, even in Western European or North American democracies, North America's democracies. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about some of the long term or long durée history behind what we are witnessing, including the role of Russia and the breakup of the Soviet Union, something that gives us an even deeper context, and then we can get to some of the more contemporary implications for the subregion.
Sure. So I guess if there's one to take away from this conversation today, what I would say is it all comes down to how do you change leaders? And in democratic countries, there is an institutionalized process for changing leaders, and that is we go to the polls. And on a good day, and I think your caveat about what's happening in North American democracies is well taken. But on a good day, right, we go to the polls, we elect, and the outcome of that election is who determines who the next leader is going to be. That's not how leadership change works in Kazakhstan. It's not how leadership change works in Central Asia broadly. Regrettably, it's not how leadership change works in many places in the Middle East. Here, we have this fundamental problem, which is in the absence of institutionalized mechanisms to ensure a peaceful transition of power, not even a democratic transition of power, right, but just simply a peaceful transition of power. How do things work? And it's just not clear, right? In the case of some Middle Eastern countries, you have institutions of dynastic succession, and to a certain extent, that helps promote stability, where everybody anticipates that the ruler's family, someone in the ruler's family, often the brother or the son, will take over power. In Kazakhstan, that option was not available to the long-serving leader, President Nazarbayev. President Nazarbayev has no sons, or I should say, no legitimate sons, right? No publicly recognized sons, and his the idea of him transferring power to a daughter, I think was just something that he himself could not, I think, wrap his mind around. So, I mean, this is the fundamental issue: is how does someone like Nazarbayev, as he's getting older and older, how does he transfer power to someone else? And frankly, he just didn't do a particularly good job of it. So I think that's the key issue. Now, I can go into the dynamics of how it was actually done, but let me just pause here because I know I've been going on for a little bit. But I think that's the fundamental driver is there's no institution for peacefully and logically transferring power in Kazakhstan.
And if we want to look at the more recent history, How has the situation in Kazakhstan and the rest of the Central Asian republics, how has the situation deteriorated or improved generally, if you can look at the sub-region as a whole, since the breakup of the Soviet Union, and what is happening now in Kazakhstan, or what has, I'm assuming it is ongoing. This is not something that just, it's not just one event. What are the implications for the sub-region in the context of what Russia is going through under Putin's leadership and what is going on now in Ukraine? Is there something that we need to pay attention to in terms of the broader implications of the current invasion, or the broader implications of what is happening in Kazakhstan to the sub-region?
Well, let's take the sub-region first, independent of uh, the foreign relations with Russia. I mean, I think that the bigger picture that we have to look at is this issue of how do autocrats transfer power is not going to go away. I think we see a pattern here in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan where, while the autocrat is healthy, there can be a degree of stability. At least that's historically been the case. So, in the case of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev was in power from 1989 to 2018, right? So almost three decades. Um, uh, so as long as someone is healthy, and the autocrat's healthy, then I think we can expect some degree of stability. So the question then becomes, what happens when autocrats near their the end of their rule because of old age? Now, in the case of Nazarbayev, there's a sense that he had Parkinson's disease. He was unable to continue ruling. And so what Nazarbayev tried to do was he tried to give him a seat he tried to hold on to a few levers of power while handing over power to a chosen successor. So, he remained the head of the Security Council, and he essentially had a veto power over any other decisions that were made in the country. Now, as we saw in January, this just didn't work out particularly well. So January was as much an overthrow of Nazarbayev's continued hold on power through the seat at the Security Council as it was this economic protest. I mean, they're all interlinked. So what regionally, what does this tell us? This tells us that when autocrats age out and they try to protect themselves by clinging on to at least some vestiges of power, it doesn't work, right? So it didn't work well in the case of Kazakhstan, and ultimately Tokayev, who was Nazarbayev's chosen successor, he was able to effectively use these protests as a way to oust the Nazarbayev inner circle that was still very much present in Central Asia. So I think what it tells us regionally is it's still very difficult, right? It's still going to remain very difficult ensuring patterns of stable autocratic succession. In the case of Uzbekistan, the leader died, right? So that's maybe one way, right? You stay in power until the very end, but still, we face the challenge of other elites when they see these autocrats getting older and more infirm, of defecting. To your first question about what does this tell us for the region in the long run? I think we can continue to expect instability in these countries, particularly as the autocrats get older and older. So next, we're going to have to take a look at Tajikistan. Right, this is a place where the leader is getting older and perhaps frailer, absent some kind of external intervention, like we saw in the case of Russia intervening in Kazakhstan, this instability could potentially be very bloody. And this was the case of Kazakhstan in 2010. In Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Kyrgyzstan had a similar kind of situation, and the Kyrgyz government asked Russia to intervene, and Russia didn't intervene. So it's I think short of institutionalized mechanisms of succession suddenly appearing, this is going to remain an unstable region for many years to come.
Button thing. I gotta get this mute button thing down. So thank you, Eric. In terms of what's happening recently, has the to what extent and how has the situation in Central Asia and in Kazakhstan affected the decision that Putin has made? Is it something that that is fundamentally related, or is it just something that can be brushed off as a coincidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I think it would be a mistake to draw any causal link between Putin's decision to invade Ukraine with what happened with the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan. Uh, in a couple for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, the intervention in Kazakhstan was minimal. I think that was compared to what we're seeing in Ukraine. Uh, the Russian presence was very small, and I don't think the Russians there was even a single shot fired by Russians in Kazakhstan. I'd have to check that, but I think that's right. But I think there are some relationships. So the first relationship is that Putin was invited into Kazakhstan. And I think that suggested to him that, there are people in the quote unquote near abroad that welcome Russian intervention. And I think, at least if you take the Kremlin's discussion of what they expected to happen in Ukraine at face value, that is that they were going to be warmly received by the population. That his intervention in Kazakhstan, where he was invited in essentially by the government, may have emboldened him to intervene in Ukraine in the sense that he thought that the Russian intervention would be welcome. So I mean there is something there. The other thing that I would point to is there's uh, the media portrayal of Russia's intervention in Kazakhstan was that of a superpower deploying shock troops very effectively. It basically it portrayed Russia as a very competent superpower, and I think that image that he saw maybe had also emboldened him to do what he did in Ukraine. So in that sense, there may be some connections. But what was going on in Ukraine, Russia's designs on Ukraine, this has been in the making since 2014. So something I think that everybody has to keep in mind, those watching this, is Russia's invasion didn't suddenly begin last week. Russia took Crimea in 2014, Donbass 2014, right? So this has been going on for a long time. Ukraine's been paying the price for a long time. It's only just now that we in the West are paying attention.
Can you tell us a little bit about how we might expect the future to unfold? I'm not asking you to predict in terms of the expansion of any form of hostility because of the invasion, because of the unrest, whether in terms of a response. There's been discussions of no-fly zones that have been rejected so far for the obvious reasons, because historically no-fly zones is a slippery slope into like full out war. And to what extent does economic Russia's economic woes influence its course of action? One of the things that we have actually learned as you go in depth, and as you have also shared the importance of historic the longue durée view, is that this could very well be Russia trying to prevent a further collapse or a further degradation of its economic situation because of all sorts of economic sources and resources, such as pipelines going through Ukraine, oil pipelines, oil and gas. Um, what might we expect going forward, and what are the factors or developments that we should keep an eye on?
Yeah. Let me take this question of expansion first, or similar Russian attempts elsewhere. Uh, I've given a couple talks on this in recent weeks about why did Russia intervene in Kazakhstan? Why is Russia invading in Kyrgyzstan? Why did Russia not intervene in Kyrgyzstan in 2010? Now, I don't pretend to be in the head of Putin, and frankly, I'm grateful that I'm not in the head of Putin. That must be a very dark place to be. Uh, but if we are to ask ourselves why did Russia do what it did in Kazakhstan? Why did Russia do what it did or is doing in Ukraine? I mean, I think it comes down to three things. Uh, Russia looks at its, again in quotation marks, near abroad, and makes calculations about how to intervene based on, I think, three things. I think the first most important thing is, can Russia ensure a pliant leader, a friendly leadership in a near abroad country? And for a long time in Ukraine, Russia could, right? Russia had puppet leaders essentially ruling Ukraine. Uh, um, uh, if Russia can have a pliant leadership, say like in Belarus with Lukashenko right now, right? Then of course there's no reason to intervene. There's no why expand when you can rule through essentially a puppet government. So places like Ukraine with Zelensky, there's an imperative perceived by Russia to intervene in that sense because Putin can't control the government. In a place like Kyrgyzstan in 2010, there was no imperative to intervene because Putin was assured that the Kyrgyz government in 2010 was going to remain loyal to Moscow. Kazakhstan in 2022, I don't think that Putin had any question that Tokayev was going to remain loyal to Moscow. I think where the question came in was that the Kremlin was worried that Tokayev wouldn't remain in power, that he might get overthrown. And so that's why Russia intervened. So Russia intervened in the case of Kazakhstan to maintain a leadership that was friendly, and Russia is invading in the case of Ukraine to overthrow a leadership that's not friendly. So I think in that sense, we have to look at the nature of the leadership in the country, whether it's pliant or not pliant, whether it's friendly or not friendly to Moscow. I think the second thing that we have to look at about your question about, is Russia going to potentially expand elsewhere? Well, what are Russia's critical strategic interests? Um, a lot of people say, oh, Kazakhstan's potentially going to be next. Northern Kazakhstan, this is the area that Solzhenitsyn used to point to as historically Russian. There's lots of Russians in northern, 3.5 million Russians in northern Kazakhstan. And this was one of the things that Solzhenitsyn harped on all the time. Moscow should go in and take northern Kazakhstan. The reality of the matter is that Kazakhstan, while strategically important, has nowhere to go, right? It's not going to go to, it's not going to fall into the Chinese orbit. It's got a long border with China. It's not going to go to Mongolia, right? It's not. It's just there's nowhere for Kazakhstan to go. So strategically, Kazakhstan is stuck with Russia. I don't think Kazakhstan is ever going to become part of NATO. Ukraine, of course, I mean, that's a completely different story. You've got Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, already members of Ukraine, and we have Zelensky addressing the European Parliament discussions of Ukraine becoming part of the EU. I think there's a real strategic threat perceived by Putin. By the way, that's not a threat that's perceived by many other Russians. I mean, many other Russians would love to become part of the European Union as well. So this is something that Putin perceives, not Russia broadly. I want to make that distinction clear. And then the other thing about expansion is this issue of deterrence. Now, does Russia face credible threats to actions for expansion? I think Putin miscalculated, and I think we're kind of surprised that he miscalculated as well in the case of Ukraine, because in 2014, as much as I admire President Obama for doing many of the other things he did, he was completely ineffective in rallying any kind of response, and other European leaders were completely ineffective in rallying any kind of international response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. And the West essentially said to Russia, "You can do this stuff and get away with it." So the deterrence was minimal, and my guess is that Putin probably anticipated that the deterrence would have been maybe not at the same low level, but certainly somewhat muted. I don't think he expected what he's seeing right now. Um, uh, to the extent that this can hold, that the entire world can remain united, and this is not just the West, right? This is and Turkey, right? I mean, Singapore, Japan, right? To the extent that the entire world can remain united in trying to deter Russian expansion, then I think he'll think twice. So my hope is that, to your question about further expansion, I hope it's limited. Now, to your question about economics. I guess there's a bunch of different areas we can take this. I mean, there's this question about the pain that you and I and colleagues around the world are going to experience because of these sanctions, which is relatively minimal. There's the pain that our colleagues in Russia are going to experience because of these sanctions, which are considerable. But not to be overlooked is, I think, and since we're talking about Kazakhstan, there's also the fairly substantial pain that our colleagues and friends in Central Asia are going to experience as a result of these sanctions. And frankly, this is something that no one's talking about. There are considerable knock-on effects of these sanctions that are going to profoundly affect my friends, and of course, not just my friends, everyone living in Central Asia. And I hope the world doesn't turn a blind eye to that. We have to be ready to help mitigate some of the pain that people in already incredibly poor countries are going to feel as a result of this.
Thanks, Eric. Let's sort of wrap up by talking a little bit about what's happening in this country in terms of the coverage and the reaction of ordinary people, which is basically a major outcry against what is taking place. Do you think, in any way, shape, or form, this outcry, this the fact that everybody's incensed by this development in Ukraine, do you think it will also have an effect on public opinion regarding potential future actions that our own government, the United States, might take that is of a similar nature? Because there's some sort of a duality here where we're outraged at what's happening, but we have done similar things over the past decades, including in Iraq in 2003, which is a major flagrant event that had zero cause, at least in terms of what was stated as the cause for our invasion of Iraq and literally destruction of the country. So, you think that this sort of reaction is going to affect public opinion in the United States regarding potential future quote unquote adventures that are of a similar nature on our
Sure.
behalf?
I see. Okay, I see what you're saying. So, might this give the United States pause when it considers something like going into Iraq in the future? Is that
Or something
that's
of the sort, something that is, not like almost a choice war.
yeah. Well, first, one thing I wanted to talk about, and I think it's you and I were talking about this before we started the recording. Um, I do find it striking how we collectively here in the United States have responded so strongly to what's going on in Ukraine. And I think that response is correct, right? I don't fault anyone for their strong response. But I do think it's worth noting that when similar things have happened in other countries outside of Europe, the response has been on, I think, a different level. Not always, but certainly, I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, um, the indignation and the frustration and the sense of you know um, these are our compatriots has been, I think, on a much higher level in this case than it has been, say, when we're looking at similar horrific events going on in other parts of the world. So I think that should give us all a little bit of pause, and something that when the time comes when we have time to reflect, I hope we do reflect on this. This is not to take anything away from against from our current very strong reaction. I think that's justified. I guess what worries me is how come we're not seeing similar outrage and indignation when other similar kinds of things happen elsewhere in the world, and I hope we do. So I think that's where do we change public opinion in the future. I hope that's one area where we see change public opinion, where we as people in the United States begin to pay more attention and realize that these kinds of things are happening elsewhere, and we really need to be paying attention. But to your point about will this give the U.S. government pause in other ventures in the future. Um, one thing I think it's important to emphasize is that if you follow the Russian press and Russian state press, I'm not talking about wonderful outlets like TV Rain or Echo Moskvy, but the state press. Uh, what you just mentioned about Iraq, U.S. The horrific killing of civilians as a result of U.S. drone bombings. Um, U.S. Ventures abroad. These are all things that the Russian leadership point to justify what it's doing in Ukraine. If you listen to Putin's unhinged Monday speech from, gosh, it seems like a year ago, but like a week and a half ago, he specifically referenced some of these things, right? So to the extent that there is a degree of reflexiveness in, say, the State Department or the Oval Office, and people say, look, if we do these things, it gives legitimacy to other people to do these things. I think, perhaps, but Sam, to be perfectly honest, I'm doubtful, and I'm doubtful for the following reason. If you look at the current phrasing, even in President Biden's, I think, fairly powerful State of the Union address last night, if you look at the U.S. framing of these kinds of engagements on the part of the United States and then on the part of, say, Russia, the framing is that democracy always prevails over autocracy. So there's this sense that because the United States is a democracy, that it invariably fights just wars. Now we know that that's not the case, but if you look at the framing of the Iraq War, if you look at the framing of Afghanistan, if you look at the framing of Syria, right, it's the United States is engaging in a just war because it's a democracy. Whereas if you look at what Russia is doing, Russia is not fighting a just war because it can't, because it's ruled by an autocrat. Now, I agree with that second statement. It can be very difficult for an autocrat to fight a just war. Now, we could debate about Stalin or World War II, but in general, it's quite difficult. But it doesn't. I don't think the opposite obtains. I don't think just because a country is a democracy, it is fighting a just war. But I think regrettably, our leaders feel empowered because they are democratically elected to fight wars. When I do wish that we gave considerably more thought before we initiated these international ventures.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. I know this is a kind of worms and it's a very detailed matter, but it is for all of us important because we're in a world that where these sorts of instigations, developments are likely to go on. Unfortunately, which also reminds me that given what's happening in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, it just gives me a hint that I will be seeing you again in various ways, talking about this, and hopefully we can co-host something on the broader that region, because it's difficult to speak of Russia and Central Asia and Europe, as one place, but it's kind of like connected in the ways that we have been discussing today. Kazakhstan with Russia, Russia with Ukraine, and Eastern Europe as well as Europe. So in many ways, this is a topic that I think we will return to. I promised you we will not spend more than 30 to 40 minutes, and I want to keep my promise so that when I invite others to the Schar podcast, we are able to conclude within a limited time. But before I let you go, I want to ask you if you have anything to say as a closing statement. And right before you do this, I want to share with anybody watching that we actually do have a Schar Conversations podcast page on the Schar website, and I'll go to it right now. So this is the Schar Conversation podcast page, and it basically includes all of the previous podcasts, about 11 of them, with this one. The last one was on the 2020 election. The one before also was on the topic with different speakers. We also have a number of podcasts on pedagogy, online teaching, the pandemic, and things that are related to what we are doing as educators. Maybe I should take my name out of this screen. And we would love for others to join in the future. And as I shared, I hope that you will join me in addressing what I fear will be a deteriorating situation in Ukraine.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Bassam, for starting this podcast series. I think it's been a great help for those of us who are on it, just to kind of put our ideas together. And I hope it's a help to those of you who may be watching. So, thank you for the opportunity. I wish I could say that I look forward to joining you on future podcasts, but I also realize that while I look forward to doing speaking with you, Bassam, personally, I do regret that oftentimes the reasons for why we come together for these kinds of discussions often surround
Unfortunately.
crisis.
All right, absolutely. No, I take that. I take that well. All right, thanks very much, Eric. I also look forward to seeing you in person at at any event or anywhere, and I hope that again that we are able to see each other under better circumstances. In the meantime, thanks to anyone who is watching. I think we should make this conversation mandatory for our students at this moment, given what is going on. So we will share it with our colleagues and hope that they will make it available to them. Thanks very much, Eric. Have a great day.
Thank you, Bassam. Take care.